National Educational Television presents Perspectives.
100 frustrating years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro community has arrived at a decision to celebrate this centennial in an all-out effort to achieve full rights now, this summer. The men who have come here today to sit down and talk with us are the leaders of the Negro community, who have assumed the risk of transforming the American ideal into reality. These men, sometimes labeled the Big Five, are the captains of 5 of the most vigorous organizations, different in their history, their methods, and their means, but united in their purpose. They lead the battle for freedom now. Roy Wilkins is the executive secretary of the oldest and biggest Negro organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Its campaign against segregation has historically centered on legal and legislative proceedings. But at its convention in Chicago a few weeks ago, thousands of delegates and their leaders insisted upon more militant, direct action. Whitney Young Jr. is executive director of the National Urban League. With chapters in 65 cities and the largest budget and professional staff of all Negro organizations, the Urban League seeks civil rights progress through biracial cooperation and important social service programs. James Farmer is National Director of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. CORE, which pioneered the sit-in techniques in the early 40s, and more recently the Freedom Rides, is active in the North as well as in the South. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., a symbol of active nonviolence, is the founder and the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Dr. King, who received national and international prominence after the 1956 Montgomery bus boycott, coordinated the recent demonstrations in Birmingham. James Forman is executive secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Formed in 1960 at a Raleigh meeting of the Southern Negro College students, it has provided vigorous youthful leadership in segregation protests and has spearheaded the voter registration drives.
Now, to open this conversation, our host, Dr. Kenneth Clark, professor of psychology at the City College of New York.
Gentlemen, I certainly want to thank you for taking time out of a terribly busy schedule to talk with us this evening. I know that the entire country, and certainly the President of the United States and some congressmen, would like to know about the plans for a march on Washington. Mr. Wilkins, would you like to tell us what are the plans as of this date?
I wish I could tell you all the plans, but I can't. There will be a march on Washington, of course, and as was announced after a conference with the chief of police in Washington, D.C., the plan is for a huge march to the Lincoln Memorial and a meeting there. On the way, what was described as a brief demonstration at the White House. But we hope to have this an outpouring of expression on the part of the people who wish Congress and the nation to know how they feel, how very deeply they feel about civil rights legislation. I think it's fair to say, wouldn't you say, Martin, that this is no attempt to blackjack anybody. We want to show how we feel.
Exactly. We are not going to Washington to intimidate any congressman or any senator. It will give a large number of people an opportunity to articulate their longings and aspirations for freedom, their desire to see meaningful, forthright civil rights legislation in this session of Congress. And of course, we also intend to arouse the conscience of the nation over the economic plight of the Negro 100 years after emancipation. And I think it can have a great impact. I think it will dramatize the issue. It will have educational value in that it will allow many people to see and understand the continued indignities and injustices which Negroes confront all over the nation.
James Forman, you of CORE, are you joining this march?
We are indeed at our convention a couple of weeks ago in Dayton, Ohio. The march in Washington was given top priority for this summer. We consider it extremely important, and I would like to say too that all over the country it has captured the imagination of hundreds of thousands of people. Now, we don't know how many of them will be marching to Washington, but a goodly number will. They feel keenly about this, and they want the seat of government. They want the American conscience to know how they feel, and they want to express it.
Whitney Young of the Urban League. Traditionally, the Urban League has not been a direct action organization. Nonetheless, as I understand it, the Urban League is united in this approach to civil rights problems in America today. You're aware that the President has cautioned that he would just as soon have the march postponed or not occur. How does the Urban League stand on this?
Well, the Urban League draws a distinction between picketing and what we would call a broadly representative group of people who are not focused at any particular institution, but are simply witnessing their convictions in support of the President's program. The National Urban League will certainly cooperate with this march, and I would imagine that at the local Urban League level, that many local Urban Leaguers will be participating both as board members and as staff people. We see this as an all-inclusive demonstration of our belief in the President's program, and since it has been declared to be an orderly demonstration with a rally, at which time I hope to be one of the people who will speak in the interest of the Urban League toward preparing people for the new opportunities. At this level, we will be cooperating.
James Forman, does this hold for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee too?
Well, yes, we'll be there. And I think it's important that the march go off because there is legislation which many people have gone to jail for the substance. That is, the lunch counter demonstrations throughout the South have to be sort of brought to some climax, and it could be done in this public accommodations bill, which is before the Congress. Then, of course, it just left the Delta and a lot of poor people over there, people who make $2.25 a day for 12 hours of work. And so some legislation has to come out of the Congress of the United States to deal with these problems.
Gentlemen, you are all united and agreed on the advisability of having an orderly, systematic march to demonstrate the Negro's support for effective civil rights action. Nonetheless, people like Agnes Myers, Roy, president of the board of the NAACP, and other white liberals and friends have cautioned against having a major demonstration for civil rights this summer. How do you deal with this?
I'd like to say, Kenneth, that Arthur Spingarn and Agnes Meyer have to be separated because Arthur got off a boat from Europe and was met with this question, and it's his declaration that he made no condemnation of the march. He simply cautioned that it ought to be for a purpose. And anyway, he was dealing with something that he'd been out of the country for 8 weeks, and the situation has been very speedy since then. But Mrs. Meyer is a different kettle of fish, and she represents, I believe, that opinion that the march ought not to be held because it will excite somebody and it may get out of hand. And I'd like to say this right now. It's our position in the NAACP that the opponents of civil rights legislation left no doubt as soon as the president spoke. In fact, they didn't wait for him to speak. They began announcing their opposition and what they intended to do. They were going to filibuster, they were going to hold up appropriation measures, they were scaring the country that they weren't going to get a tax cut on account of civil rights. They're doing all the boogeyman stunts. And if they're going to use Washington as their base of operations for opposition to this bill, we don't see anything wrong with using Washington as our base to indicate support for this bill. And in my estimation, this march is going to be a 100% outpouring of the disgust and distress of black Americans and white liberals over the way the Congress has handled this bill. I see nothing wrong with it at all, and I brush aside all people who talk about objections to it.
Yes.
I think that in any such demonstration as the march, which is planned, you will expect loud outpouring of cries, of fears from many, many people who don't want it to take place, who are afraid that something might happen. But it seems to me that it reflects a lack of understanding of the nature of the times in which we are living. The fact that Negroes all over the country are concerned and are aroused and must express their feeling. They've waited 100 years, and that's too long to wait.
But what about white friends and liberals who have worked in these organizations for many years, who now say, look, let's not go this fast. Let's not...
we don't have people like that. I'm sorry.
Our
Our telephone is ringing with white people who want to get into the march.
Ken, may I say that I can speak for myself and my organization. We don't judge our friends on the basis of the color of their skin. We judge them on the basis of the fact of whether or not they are willing to go all the way with us. If they are not willing to go all the way, then they are not friends of ours.
Now, we've said that these are interracial organizations, but you five gentlemen are Negroes. You are assuming the leadership, and you are asking white liberals and white friends to go along with the Negro speaking for himself rather than speaking through white surrogates.
I would like to make this point because I think there is a misconception that any white people who happen to serve on your boards or committees are therefore automatically there to exercise control and restraint. Yeah. This is not the experience of the Urban League. There are many white people who serve on our boards who are asking for more militancy. I speak for the National Urban League at their insistence, not at my demanding, because they feel that a Negro is best able to express the hopes and the longings of his people. And so it is not something, a position that I assume, but it's one that they insist that I assume.
But this certainly is not the picture that Mr. Powell gave in his recent criticism of the NAACP, and certainly not the persistent picture that Malcolm X and the black nationalists
Well, can't
give.
we skip both of those gentlemen
as
having, as being ill-informed on this matter?
All right.
Because as far as the NAACP is concerned, this has been a partnership from the very beginning.
Correct.
And for the past, well, I've been there 32 years. For the past 25 years, the Negroes have furnished the bulk of the money to carry the NAACP fight, and it's utterly ridiculous to talk about white people controlling the organization.
I think, Kenneth, that we ought to be clear that there is a desire on the part of Negroes for self-expression through leadership of civil rights organizations. This is important because Negroes have been denied that self-expression for so many years. But this does not mean, in any sense of the word, as far as I'm concerned, that white persons who are sincere cannot participate and cooperate.
Exactly.
And I think it's very important to have this participation. I think it would be very dangerous and even tragic if the struggle in the United States for civil rights degenerated to a racial struggle of blacks against whites, so to speak.
Amen.
It is a tension between justice and injustice, and we enlist consciences in the struggle. We appreciate the participation in this movement of white persons of goodwill, and we have many of them, fortunately, and I think the number's growing every day, and this helps to keep the struggle on the level that it should be on.
Sure. Certainly the National Council of Churches planning to participate in the
Yes.
march in Washington.
And the Catholics just
sure.
announced participation in the march specifically, in specific language. And in your student movement, don't you have white students
Oh, definitely.
who have been beaten up
Right.
just like
That's
Negro
the
students?
Same thing. I'd like to amplify, however, it's not a dissent, but on something that Jim said, which I think is one of the reasons why we have to have, unfortunately, civil rights organizations. It would be better if we didn't have any, that is, if we didn't have any race problems. But he was saying that Negroes have been denied the self-expression you see among Negro youth and what have you. I think that in the last 10, 12 years, the increased militancy has been because they have seen Negroes do things. And in a sense, you see, part of the fight that we have had, it seems to me, is to counter brainwash, if I may use that term, the people and make them feel that they have an identity themselves, that they can do something for themselves.
They can be effective.
They can be effective, and I think that perhaps this may be what you're implying, that is that the Negro masses have to, in a sense, see Negroes in some position of leadership. And I don't think it takes the extreme position that it has to be a black chauvinistic movement, no. But it's important for kids to see Negroes doing something, just like it's important for Ralph Bunche or someone else to be in the United Nations or to have responsible Negro leaderships in other positions.
Well, gentlemen, it's certainly clear to me that there is no disagreement on the advisability of the march. There seems to be no question that there's going to be a march, and as far as I can understand you gentlemen, this is not a racist march. This is a march of aroused Americans who want to demonstrate and assume their rights to petition their
And
Congress
want to witness.
and witness and support the President's civil rights legislation. Could we come specifically to this matter of the President's civil rights legislation? Is this enough?
I'd like to comment on it. You've spoken of the President's legislation, and actually, as I see the march, it's not only the President's legislation, because I don't think his legislation went far enough. I think that some things he left out. For example, Part 3 of the 1957 bill was not included, which would have given the Attorney General the right to file suits on all violations of civil rights, not only voting rights and schools and so forth. Furthermore, I think that the President might well have recommended withholding funds from segregated schools, as well as granting technical and financial aid to those who are desegregating.
And
The
along with
FEPC
this,
was
yes,
left out.
that was left out.
Which is very important. It presently is a pending bill, but it was left out of the package bill, and certainly nothing affects the Negro more today than the inability to find adequate employment. He represents 2.5 to 3 times as great the unemployment group as any group in the country.
Whitney, the Attorney General would seem to disagree with you in terms of his testimony for Congress. He says that the most disturbing thing for Negroes is the public accommodation segregation.
Well, you know, it's difficult, really, and I think this is a trap that many people fall into of isolating one aspect of this problem and saying this is the answer, because what invariably happens, the person speaking tends to identify that thing farthest from his responsibility. The truth of the thing is that it's a vicious circle. Unless people are adequately educated, they can't possibly find good jobs. And unless people can find good jobs, they can't buy good housing, which puts them in good neighborhoods where they can get a good education. So instead of being one major thing, it's a group of things.
Yes, that's true, but it seems to me, of course, that the public accommodations matter, which is now being batted around in the Senate Commerce Committee, is the most abrasive and pervasive of the aspects of a Negro's life. Every time he steps out of his front door in the morning until he comes home at night, he runs the risk, and some of them don't run a risk, they run the certainty of this kind of denial and humiliation and mistreatment. And sometimes in the South, as you well know, in many subtle ways. You walk into a store and you're ahead of you're the next one to be waited on, but 3 white people come up and they get waited on first. This is a matter, the Negroes meet this. In many places they have to ride on the back of the bus. And they do want a Coca-Cola and can't get it. Now these seem small things, but then I think the Attorney General was talking about the things that rub people the wrong way and make them say, oh, let's get rid of it, you know.
So as I understand,
I agree with that.
I'm sorry.
No, that's right. I think I would underscore that. And, you know, there are other areas of life which are very subtle, but which are not even being covered in the bill. And then there's some pronounced ways. I'm just thinking of the fact that you drive through the South. In some states, you can't even stop at the restrooms, and this is humiliating to women, you know, and it's very...
And of course, uncomfortable.
Well, it's very uncomfortable, but it's one of these little daily things. But I think that there are two areas that should be covered, you know, and that's the question of the voting bill. I don't see why we can't have universal suffrage for all Negroes. I mean, I really don't see why it has to be just a 6th grade educational level, because that's a device, and I think we were talking beforehand about how many people would be covered.
The Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is putting a great deal of its effort on voting, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we have a great program down, I think, in the Delta of Mississippi, but Roy might want to amplify on just how many people would be covered by a 6th grade education.
Well, the literacy test bill,
Yes.
you know, we agreed, well, we estimated, we couldn't, that not more than 100,000 Negroes would be added to the rolls under the literacy test. This is, Martin, you remarked on the number of people who didn't have a 6th grade education in one state. For 58%, I think it was, in Louisiana.
That's right.
Well,
Kenneth,
may I get one thing clear? Are you saying that the President's Civil Rights package does have a limitation on 6th grade?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And we testified before the House and suggested universal suffrage. I mean, there's just no reason why a person is not 21, he can't vote. He can go into the Army whether he can read or write. So why shouldn't he be able to vote?
And this is no sign that the person isn't intelligent, that the person doesn't have some basic intelligence, but because of discrimination and other conditions, many of these people haven't had an opportunity to get an education, and I think they should have the right to vote, and this is very basic.
It seems to me that one thing that we need to avoid is saying that one part of the legislation is more important than others, because this might lead to horse trading, you know, trading one part over against the other, so that we might find it compromised and watered down. We have to make it clear we want the whole thing.
This seems to be the point that Whitney was making.
Yeah, and the point I'm really making is that those people who seem to feel that the President had suggested the most comprehensive thing possible are really not adequate. The compromise has already been made. Any compromise beyond this would be taking away vital legislation.
Yes, I think this is a point that needs to be made, but I still think it's true, and historically it will be supported, that no president has recommended a bill of this scope before, regardless of how we who suffer may feel its limitations, and I think we ought to work with that. Dangerous, as Jim has said, Jim Farmer has said, to pick out priorities, and because the opposition will start concentrating on your target. They say, well, what do you think is the number one? And this is, we have to avoid.
Roy, you made the point that no president in certainly my lifetime has made this kind of civil rights recommendation to Congress. Why do you think President Kennedy did this?
He did it because a crisis was created that demanded the attention of the nation on the highest level. Just like, well, a dust bowl is something beyond the state and beyond the region and demands federal action. A great disaster like Texas City demands national action. A great flood demands national action. And here we have a crisis in human rights brought about by one of the, in great part, by all of us, of course, but triggered by a man who sits around this table. And I think there's no doubt that Birmingham dramatized and brought into focus what Martin Luther King and his associates did in Birmingham, made it, the nation realize that at last the crisis had arrived.
Mm-hmm. Well, now you mentioned so clearly and objectively the important role of Martin Luther King in dramatizing the urgency and insistence of the Negro. The way you said that, it doesn't seem to me to be consistent with the rather persistent rumors that there's rivalry among...
Well, now you don't see any of us chained together around this table, do you? We came here voluntarily. As the truth of the matter is, that we have been meeting off and on over the past few years. I remember Jim Forman down in Atlanta, a couple of meetings we had down there. We met Martin Luther King all over the United States. Jim Farmer has sat in on 12 or 14 weeks of, and along with Whitney Young, of assessment of the civil rights picture and a projection of the future. And we've just come from a meeting making some more plans for the March on Washington, all of us together. Yes. I think these rumors about the split, as I said before, I don't know, Martin, whether this language will get by with you or not, but anybody who bets on the Negro split is going to lose a bundle.
Well, I quite agree with that, Roy. I think we're more united than ever before. And I think that while there are those who would like to see a split and they find sensational outpourings therein, I'm convinced that we are united in the goals we seek and that we are working together in terms of the methods. This does not mean that there will have to be absolute uniformity. I don't think this is desirable. There must be a diversified attack. This is a complicated, difficult problem.
Would you?
Well, I might inject a note here that might suggest some difference as far as the Urban League and the direct action groups that are here represented. That being a question of emphasis. The Urban League, in the case of the legislation, for example, recognizes that most of this legislation will affect largely the South, but have little meaning as far as the North is concerned. Most of these problems are already resolved. So we are extremely concerned that the slogan freedom, equal opportunity, will not become a cruel hoax, an empty kind of thing, because of other forces at work.
One thing seems curious to me in all of this talk about splits and internal warfare in civil rights organizations. When 1 or 2 or 3 Democrats disagree on tactics or timing, there's no headlines about internal splits and warfare. When the same thing happens in the Republican Party, they don't talk about warfare. But if Roy Wilkins and I should honestly disagree on tactic or strategy or timing, then the headlines are warfare.
Yes. Well, you understand, don't you, Jim? The Negro just has a great cross to bear. That's
you aren't allowed the same
right.
problem.
That's right. That's right. But I'd like to go back to something you brought up, though, Kenneth, and that is, what is the cause for this legislation? Because, and I would agree with Roy in terms of this crises, and the fact of the matter is that the legislation should have been introduced a long time ago, but it has not been, and so that it's necessary, it seems to me, and I just like to throw this out, to keep a considerable amount of pressure on. I mean, that is, the Negro does not, say in Mississippi, for instance, he has no constitutional means, that is, Eastland does not represent him, to achieve some solution, and this has to come from the government, or either he simply has to demonstrate. In other words, segregation may be like a piece of old iron, you put it in the fire to heat it up. And that so that people outside of Mississippi have to become conscious of what is going on there. For instance, there are 45 people in jail right now whose trials were held today for simply being at a voter registration meeting, and someone threw a smoke bomb in the church, and they marched down to the Justice of the Peace Office to protest, or rather to the deputy sheriff, and they were arrested for disturbing the peace. And these are old ladies, some of them 75 years old, but yet they want to stay in jail. Now, there's no recourse. I mean, they're in the federal courts, and we don't know how this is going to come out. Judge Clayton is ruling on it. So I just think, you see, that the organizations would make a mistake, and I haven't had a chance to discuss this thoroughly with everybody here, if we don't sort of keep the pressure on, in a sense.
Oh, by all means.
Yeah.
It must be.
But each organization conceives of pressure in a different way, am I right? For example, your concept of pressure isn't exactly the same as the Urban League's.
Well, except that we subscribe to that, but we just don't have time to do that.
The people that have the vote don't realize how much they could do by writing a letter.
That's right.
A congressman said to me, I have 8 letters on civil rights. 8 from his district. 8. And 5 of those were from white people. Now, you don't have to write a you know, polemic. You just have to write a postcard saying, please vote for the Civil Rights Bill.
Tell me, gentlemen, do you think that this legislation, or a substantial part of it, or all of it, will pass in this session of Congress?
It isn't just going to pass without a great deal of work being done. It's going to require hard work. It's going to require mobilizing the total nation behind this legislation. But I believe if we do that, if not only we around this table, but if the people of goodwill of this nation really go out to get this legislation through, there is a possibility that it will go through. We've got to get senators committed, we've got to get congressmen committed, and we've got to arouse people from their apathetic slumbers in many states in the Midwest where there is this tendency to engage in the coalition with Southern Dixiecrats. And I think if we can do that, we can get this legislation through, even though we confront difficulties.
I certainly agree with that. In traveling around the country, however, I hear many people make utterances which seem to indicate that they think the millennium will have arrived after we get civil rights legislation. That is not the case. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Even if we get the entire package that the President asked, plus various of the other good bills that are pending before Congress, a good legislation does not automatically enforce itself. We then have a problem of seeing to it that it is enforced in town after town, city after city, and only the will of the people will bring about the enforcement.
Plus,
I'm sorry.
excuse me.
Well, I was about to comment on what you said, but first I would like to say that I have faith that the American people today are sufficiently convinced of the determination of Negroes to be truly free and the rightness of that aspiration, that I will be terribly disappointed if there is not a tremendous amount of support from all people for this legislation. But I would agree with Jim Farmer that this will just be, to me, the beginning. It's sometimes a lot easier to get people to walk a picket line than to walk to the library, or to get people to participate, parents to demonstrate, than it is to go to PTA meetings.
But Whitney, you don't expect this support to be self-generating, do you? What is being done to mobilize the American people to provide the type of pressure which, aside from the march, what after the march?
Oh, well, we should make this clear that the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which Roy happens to chair, and is composed of some 100 organizations, have already had a meeting. And the march is just one aspect of the whole effort, one rather small aspect of the whole effort. And also, you have any number of groups today that are working at this whole matter of getting letters and contacting congressmen.
One of the heartening things about this aroused conscience that Martin spoke of a moment ago is the unprecedented activity of the organized faiths, the organized religious faiths. Yes. I think we're going places on this, but I'd like to put in a little sour note here. And I get some mail that I can't read on television, that I can't exhibit, and the postmaster delivers like this, holding it up by the people who say that Negroes ought to go back to Africa, and you're only apes anyway, and you think we're going to give you the Civil Rights Bill, you're crazy, and we'll run you in the Mississippi River first, and a whole lot of other uncomplimentary things.
I'm really more concerned about the so-called gentle people of prejudice, the people who will say, I'm with you, I am for you, but what about property values, you know, and the man's right to run his business, and what about the standards of the school being lowered? And so for these reasons, who would say, well, maybe you shouldn't have all of this right now. These are the people I'm really concerned about.
Could I comment on that? I agree with you completely. While I share Roy's concern about the extreme bigots, I'm far more concerned about the good, the decent people who don't throw a bomb as they do in Birmingham or other places in the South, but they quietly pack their bags and move away. And this, it seems to me, is more damaging to our cause. and more dangerous to the total cause of integration.
I have an answer for you, gentlemen, but go ahead.
Yeah, I guess what I'm concerned about the one in between going back to Africa and moving away, and that's basically the public officials, you see, who inflict all of this brutality, because the millennium is not going to come primarily because we have no laws to deal with police brutality in the South, which I think is a fundamental issue in this whole thing.
Jim, I suppose you are very conscious of this because your membership is on the firing line, and
yeah, and I've seen
daily
people,
the victims of police.
And Dr. King just came from Danville, and over a month ago we saw 35 people with holes in their heads as big as a size tray, inflicted by the police. And nothing has been done about it. And the government, it seems to me, ought to do something about this.
What specifically would you suggest for dealing with this?
Well, I would suggest, you see, that the government go in and file some suits. When the constitutional rights of a person is denied, the government ought to file a suit in behalf of that person. I think this gets back to Part 3.
That's right.
Now, the government says that the existing laws are inadequate, but yet they're not asking, or it is not asking, for adequate laws in this legislation. I mean, there's a whole ring of murderers down in Greenwood, and we ought not forget now that the man that killed Medgar Evers came from Greenwood, the same place where Jimmy Travis almost was killed, you know, when he was shot in the back of the neck. I mean, we can, these people are in a very bad shape in these poor areas of the United States.
Would it do any good for the president to call a conference of chiefs of police of these areas in the South? Or
well, it was suggested to him. I don't know if he's going to do that or not, but I think it would, because I think that Al Lingo, who puts the cattle shocks on people in Alabama, and the police chief of Danville and these other places ought to sit down face to face with the president, and he should ask, well, why are you doing these things?
I don't know. I wish I could agree with that, because, you know, the Attorney General made a trip to Alabama recently, and they sat face to face and they exchanged insults, one politely from Robert Kennedy, and impolitely, well, both of them were courteous according to the press, but they were cool and distant, and nobody's mind was changed, and I don't think anybody's mind will be changed. I think the only thing that changes the mind of a policeman like that is to sue him and to convict him, and to convince him that the Constitution has some control over that billy club he has in his hand.
Is there anyone who is planning to do this? Robert?
Well, now we're entering into one of the most difficult areas of civil rights, because the whole area of convicting a policeman for depriving a man of his civil rights has to be proved down to the last period and comma. Not only that, his intent has to be proved.
Jim?
Yes, I think we have an additional weapon, and that is the ballot.
Yes,
the vote, and which is why all of us here are pushing a voter registration drive. If Negroes are registered in large numbers down there in Greenwood, then the police, of course, will take a different point of view. And in Danville also, because they'll know then that they have to be responsible and responsive not only to white voters, but to Negro voters as well.
Well, I get the feeling that there are many things which have to be done, voting, pressing for desegregation and public accommodations, keeping the police from themselves being instruments of brutality. Who is, or how do we intend to coordinate all of these many things which must be done on the broad civil rights front?
There's one other aspect, if I may add to that. The campaign for biracial commissions in the South is essentially a campaign for communication, because white people in the South and in the North need education on this matter. I don't mean education on humanity as to Negroes, but they need education on the constitutional rights of Negroes and on the fact that he's a citizen. He's been here 344 years, and to hear some of them talk, they'd say, look what we're doing for you people.
Well, I think this comment about the need for the biracial committees and the fact that this was one of the major demands in some of these places in the South, like Birmingham and Danville and others, simply reinforces the validity of the Urban League as an organization, which is an interracial group. And I don't think it's any accident that in the 12 cities where we have urban leagues in the South, we have had this kind of continuous vehicle for communication between responsible white and Negro citizens on a basis of mutual respect. And so we've had in none of those
Gentlemen,
cities
I'm sorry, but I don't
demonstrations.
think you're really dealing with the question of how or what is the machinery for coordinating the various aspects of the present thrust of the Negro.
Well, let me say that there has been discussion on this, and there will be continuous. We're meeting next week on this. We met last week. This does not conceive of complete absence of any duplication or overlapping, but it does conceive of some kind of strategic deployment and division of labor geographically.
And funds?
And funds. We have been, we recently held a meeting where we appeal to the business community, the private interests of this country, to support the responsible designated organizational leadership in this area, that it was necessary that the private interests show this kind of concern.
I mean, contribute to the war chest.
So that we can channelize these heightened aspirations and the heightened impatience into constructive lines.
I don't think it would be fair, though, Professor. You want to wrap everything up neatly.
No,
We cannot.
I want to understand what's going on.
We cannot promise you that there will be a coordinated, organized, structural, formalized attack on these matters, and that each will be a portion, a part of this task. But we will say this, there's, like Martin said, there's more unity than there ever has been before, there's more division of work, and there's more coordination and backing up of each other than there has been before. Maybe in 1975 or some other time there will come an overall organization, but no other group has managed that, and why should we?
I was thinking coordination for efficiency.
Yeah.
Ken, I'd like to go back a moment to the biracial committees, if I may, and express a concern. While I'm in favor of biracial committees, I think that there is a danger in relying too heavily upon them. Because if a biracial committee exists in a given city, then it may prevent or tend to hamper direct action. The cry will be, you've got a biracial committee, put it in their hands, when you may not, through the biracial committee, be dealing with the economic power structure which gives jobs in that community, or the realtors which provide housing, or what have you.
Yes. Or they could be a disguise.
They could be a disguise.
Oh,
they could stymie action.
There's a real danger there, but I think the fact that they offer communication in some instances. For example, we opposed a Department of Government to deal with race. We said everything will be dumped in a commission. Well, we got a Civil Rights Commission, and in my estimation, it's done an outstanding job of providing ammunition for us to use. And so our fears proved to be groundless. It could be misused, and I wouldn't have it
is it not a fact that there is, to my knowledge, and maybe you have information that I don't have, no Negro who is close either to the President or to the Attorney General as a direct, independent, courageous advisor on civil rights affairs?
I don't know that there is, and if there were one, you can be sure that at least 18 million of the 20 million Negroes wouldn't agree with him being there.
Would you agree with that, Martin, that there is no need to have a Negro close to the President?
That's not what
I didn't say that.
Well, I'm sorry, that's what I heard.
No, I didn't mean that. I meant they wouldn't agree that the man was the right man.
Yeah. Well, I was about to say I didn't think Roy meant that, because I think this is a need. I think the individual who has been victimized, or the individuals who have been victimized, can certainly interpret and analyze and assess the meaning of the problem more than anybody else. And I think the President can understand the mood of the Negro more from a Negro than anybody else.
Provided he is an independent, courageous.
Yes. We wouldn't want just a window dressing appointment, but someone who thinks for himself and who would be honest and courageous in interpreting the situation.
Well, could I speak to that, Whitney, if you don't mind? Because if you've never been in Mississippi, and Roy was born, and I just have to get back, because I think I have to just try to help her. Well, I'm sorry, your family was. I was raised down there, and I want to talk about these people. See, I think the president ought to go through Mississippi, because I don't think he has any conception, any visual conception. Intellectually, he knows the suffering that's going on there. But just to see some of these shacks that people are living in, It's frightening in a sense, you know, down in Itabena. You know, it's just a very depraved
Itabena?
Itabena,
I've been to Itabena.
Isn't it a depraved?
Oh, it's really
just
something.
pitiful. And
Well, I think what we need to get at here is if we could get the total society to somehow lose this making a god of state rights and begin to see citizens as national citizens.
Right.
Because what's actually happened in this country is much of the miseducation, lack of education altogether, much of the social disorganization we see in the North that concerns us can directly be traced back to the indifference of the people in the North to the problems of the South. Right. These people later become the welfare load, the crime rate of the North. If we had adopted the concept of a citizen in Mississippi being a citizen of the United States,
right,
then we would have avoided all these problems.
Yes.
That's the way they're seen overseas.
That's right.
Yes, I want to say a word along those lines. I think the president ought not only look at the housing in Mississippi, he ought to look at the slum tenements in Harlem and in 100 Harlems across the country. Indeed, we might say that our people not only being bitten by dogs in Birmingham, Reverend King, but by the rats in the slum tenements.
Well, aren't we saying, gentlemen, that a program has not yet been worked out to grapple with the magnitude of this problem in the United States, both North and South?
It's
And
not regional.
You're so right.
isn't there a need now, because of the urgency and the seriousness of the situation, to develop a sort of crash program to lift the standards of the Negro and to get rid of the underlying conditions that produce so many social evils and develop so many social problems? I think this is what we face at this time, and I know it leads to the whole question of discrimination in reverse and all of that. But I think we've got to face the fact in this country that because of the legacy of slavery and segregation and the seeds of injustice planted in the past, that we have this harvest of confusion now, and we're going to continue to have it until we get to the root of the problem.
Well, that's that root and the rats go together.
Yeah.
The announcement of the Real Estate Brokers Association some time ago advising their members not to pay any attention to fair housing laws, that property rights still came first. And when you think of the billions of dollars in this country tied up in real estate, there isn't much that the President of the United States could do by going and looking at some slums, let's be fair.
Yeah, well,
The real power and obstacle there is the property rights structure in this country, which isn't concerned with how many kids are bitten by rats or how many people live in slums.
Well, this is precisely what the National Urban League had in mind when we announced this massive domestic
Excuse me, I wish
Marshall
I had
Plan.
you on our staff.
This is, everything seems to be feeding right in here. And
You're a salesman. That's all.
But most of you recall,
League,
most of you recall that we did announce recently, our board adopted this domestic Marshall Plan, and this was
Yes.
consciously given this name because, if you recall, this country has spent some $12 billion on rehabilitation of Europe, war-torn Europe. In a 4-year period, we have spent millions on refugees from Cuba and from Hungary. We spent all kinds of money giving free education to veterans after the war and making it possible for them to buy homes. I think the time has come for us to honestly face up to the fact that this tremendous gap due to historical deprivation that the Negro has suffered will not be closed not quickly enough unless we consciously and deliberately establish programs that call not just for equal schools but better schools and better teachers and provisions for housing and conscious recruiting at the level of employment. This has to be done in order to get rid of what I see too much of, and that is the feeling of despair and hopelessness.
You're asking, therefore, not only for a comprehensive program, but you're also asking for extra special help, compensatory
Well, you can call it what you want,
advantages.
indemnification, reparation,
I see.
Well,
whatever you want to call it.
There is
I want to
precedent for that.
dissociate myself from the word indemnification. See, but I do feel that just as you find a backward child or children, you have remedial classes for that child to bring him up to the norm.
Yeah.
And you must do something extra special for that child. And at least we conceive it to be society's duty to do that. You must do something extra special for the Negro, having stood on his neck for 250 or 300 years.
That's an excellent point. I think that Negroes have had special treatment in this country for 350 years. Special treatment of a negative sort.
That's right.
Now what Whitney and the rest of us are asking for is some special treatment of a positive sort to wipe out that gap.
Are you united in this, or is there any...
Well, I want to be
Yes,
understood
we
on
are.
it.
But I'm not asking people to hire people who aren't qualified.
And we're
But
not
you're
asking
asking-
them to skip over white people or to deny white people their chance, but we're saying that just giving the Negro an equal break
not enough.
is not enough.
No, because you see, the distance from which we have to come is so great. I mean, you know, if you talk about a 6th grade education, is the government going to see that in Mississippi the families get more than $2.25 a day so that the child will not have to come out of school to help raise money to feed the other children? See, this is a problem. So I think you ought to begin with just universal suffrage.
I wonder,
across the
gentlemen,
board.
if you're in asking for this special break, you're not asking for a special break for the nation rather than just for the Negro.
Oh,
it will be.
indeed.
Very definitely.
Look, if this country doesn't, they don't solve the human rights problem of the Negro.
Right.
The manpower problem.
This country morally is sunk.
Not only
Absolutely.
Well, what about
Not
the
only morally.
practical manpower and resources?
they've been suffering from manpower all along, and I anticipate what Jim's going to say. Not only morally sunk, but they'll be sunk.
They'll be sunk economically,
You
too.
see.
Economically, politically, and morally.
The President's Council of Economic Advisors said some months ago that discrimination in jobs against Negroes costs the country something like $13 billion a year.
If you gentlemen are correct that it cannot survive without instituting justice,
Well, it can't.
is it possible that the society will choose not to survive rather than to...
Not consciously.
Not consciously.
Not consciously.
Well,
No, I seem to sense that increasingly more people are beginning to see integration as an opportunity and not just a problem. The fact
are
that we
these
place-
only articulate people, though? Are these
No,
only the people to whom you talk? What
there are
about the
some
masses of American whites? Could it be that they are so conditioned to hate Negroes
No.
that they would rather see the society go under rather than to provide...
Well,
It's
I
not
don't-
the
I don't
masses.
think
The
it
politicians
is.
might articulate
No,
this.
the average white person in this country doesn't want to see his country go under rather than give a fair deal to the Negro. He believes in a fair deal, but he also wants to protect
Well,
himself and his job, and I don't
Gentlemen,
blame him.
I have read a number of writers on this, and the most eloquent of the writers seem to me to be Mr. Baldwin. And if I read underneath his lines, there seems to be a deep sense that maybe the American white man is not prepared for survival and justice. But as I listen to you gentlemen talk, you do seem much more optimistic than this, Jim.
Well, Kenneth, I would not go so far as to say that the American white man is prepared not to survive in order to avoid giving Negroes equal rights. But I will say that I would not be prepared at the moment to put our cause to a general referendum in this country.
No.
I don't think we'd win it.
I don't think civil rights are
we'd win it.
negotiable.
I think I could almost predict what the figure would be.
Of course.
2-1 against you.
I'm sure it would be.
Well, isn't it true that we're grappling with a problem that constantly emerges in history, that you have a few people who are crusaders in the right direction. You always have a few people who are crusaders in the wrong direction. And the vast majority are out there in the middle somewhere with a great deal of apathy and complacency. And I think we have this in our country today. The vast majority of people are not active integrationists or active segregationists. They are passive adherents to the status quo.
But
and
they
I
have
think
been
the
socialized
job,
in a
yes,
society that in which racism is dominant.
I agree, and I think the job here is for the creative minority to work on this large group, because I think these people are pliable, to the legitimate and just demands of the Negro. And I do not choose to follow the path of despair, because I think that there is a way out, even though we do have to face the problems that have developed and the conditioning that has developed as a result of this problem existing a long time. But I do think there is a way out, and I think that with the creative minority standing up with determination to solve this problem, we can solve it.
Whenever the American people have been faced with a crisis, they've come through. Now, they may have come through in ragged and bloody fashion, but they've come through. And I'm convinced that they'll come through this one, even though it involves very deep-seated emotions. I think they're going to solve it.
I've always had the feeling that one of the major problems was that the average white citizen somehow drew a correlation between status and exclusiveness, and in many cases racial exclusiveness, so that the more exclusive the neighborhood, the school, the place of employment, the higher his status. Now, I think...
But he's been taught not to like you either.
Yes,
and
but
not
now...
to like you because of the color of your skin.
Yes, but now he must be taught that this is a sign of his basic insecurity, that for years, as Baldwin put it, he has had a reason, a need to feel superior. Now we must change the norm and get people to understand that it is insecurity that makes you want to take advantage and to hate, that only the secure people now can move toward inclusiveness. It is the more intelligent, the more mature people who want this kind of thing, and only the tragically insecure need today to surround themselves with sameness.
Jim,
Well,
do you share this?
Yeah, but I would say that the change is going to come about only in proportion to the amount of pressure that we put in those people down there who are on the firing line, you know, the workers who are not represented around this table, in a sense. And as long as they keep on pushing, then I think we'll have some changes.
Gentlemen, I certainly want to thank you for what certainly is the most stimulating and to me quite instructive discussion. I think that America is indeed fortunate to have men of your breadth, your perspective, your sense of responsibility and intelligence as the leaders of probably the most significant social revolution since the 18th century. It certainly is my personal opinion that you five men are the contemporary versions of our founding fathers who risked so much and dared so much for freedom and liberty.
This has been For Freedom Now with James Farmer, National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality. James Forman, Executive Secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., President of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Roy Wilkins, Executive Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And Whitney Young Jr., Executive Director of the National Urban League. Our host has been Kenneth Clark, Professor of Psychology of the City College of New York. For Freedom Now, produced by Henry Morgenthau. Co-producer Mary Rose Maybank. Director Fred Barker.
I'm talking about pressure. You see, the National Council of Churches wouldn't be involved today if it hadn't been all of this pressure. So now they're involved. And we're going to get others involved.
They wouldn't have been involved just because of their Christianity.
That's right.
You know, Pickens used to say, paraphrase, of what you